The story began, as most corporate scandals do, not with a bang but with a whisper. The whisper began on the 23rd floor of the Halcyon Dynamics Tower, where the glass gleamed like ice and ambition was a kind of oxygen. The company was a giant, a billion-dollar empire that had built its fortune on precision, loyalty, and an image of ethical perfection. No one, least of all its employees, could have imagined that the cracks in that flawless facade would come from something as ordinary, as human, as an affair. Julia Benton had been at Halcyon for 6 years. She was known for her sharp mind, her quiet determination, and the way she never missed a deadline. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. Her work spoke for itself. She arrived early, left late, and had the kind of calm presence that steadied a room. The higher-ups trusted her. The CEO himself, Mark Callahan, had once called her the company's backbone. Mark was everything Julia was not: charismatic, loud, and effortlessly magnetic. At 47, he had the easy confidence of a man who'd built something from nothing. He had found a Halcyon in his garage 2 decades earlier and had turned it into a global powerhouse. He was married, of course, to Claire, a woman who appeared in glossy magazines, her pearls always perfectly aligned, her smile rehearsed to the millimeter. Together they were the picture of corporate success, the visionary CEO and his elegant partner. Their worlds might never have collided beyond the occasional strategy meeting, but fate, or something like it, intervened. The night the affair began, the company was celebrating its record-breaking quarterly earnings. Champagne flowed. Laughter filled the rooftop terrace. Julia had been asked to stay late to finalize a presentation. When she stepped out for air, she found Mark standing alone at the railing, staring down at the city lights as if trying to make sense of them. They spoke briefly at first, about work, about exhaustion, about the strange loneliness that came with success. One conversation turned into another, and before either of them realized it, they had built a small, dangerous bridge between their lives. It started innocently, coffee meetings that stretched into lunches, texts that lingered longer than they should have. Then one night, the line blurred beyond repair. They met in a downtown hotel under the pretense of discussing an upcoming merger. When Julia stepped into the elevator with him, the air was electric. What began as an accident soon became a pattern. Every Thursday night, same time, same place. The affair became their secret ritual, something that lived between board meetings and emails, hidden in plain sight. But secrets have weight, and eventually they begin to leak. It started with a photo, blurry, taken from across a hotel lobby. Julia's colleague, a jealous project manager named Eric, had noticed the CEO's unusual attention toward her. One careless rumor turned into a wildfire. Within weeks, whispers slithered through the hallways. "Did you hear about Julia? Did you see who she was having lunch with?"
Mark tried to control it.
He called emergency meetings, fired 1 or 2 people who knew too much, and doubled down on his public image. But the damage was already spreading. The board began to ask questions. Investors grew nervous. And then, as if fate had been waiting for the right moment to strike, the biggest blow came: a data leak tied to Halcyon's newest division, an internal audit that revealed financial irregularities. Julia was the first to be blamed. Someone no one ever proved who leaked confidential emails that showed Mark approving unauthorized transactions in her department. Screenshots of their private messages followed. The press didn't care about nuance. They saw the perfect headline: CEO's secret affair tied to financial scandal. Mark's empire began to crumble overnight. Shares plummeted. Partners pulled out. Halcyon's reputation, once pristine, became poison. Claire filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences in language that was painfully polite. Julia was escorted out of the building by security 2 days later.
She didn't resist.
She didn't speak. She just walked out, carrying a box of her belongings, a framed photo, a coffee mug, and a future that had vanished. Mark tried to fight back. He held press conferences, denied everything, blamed hackers, the media, anyone but himself. But the truth, the kind that festers behind every lie, was already out. His board forced him to resign. He left Halcyon with a severance package that couldn't buy back his name. Within months, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. Julia disappeared from public view. Some said she moved to another city, changed her name, started over. Others claimed she had sold her story to a journalist, but later backed out. Mark was last seen in Italy, buying vineyards and pretending to live a quieter life. Years later, when people talked about the fall of Halcyon, they rarely mentioned profits or strategy. They spoke about the office affair, the love story that wasn't love at all, the ambition that turned into obsession, the secret that toppled a billion-dollar company. Because in the end, it wasn't greed or competition or corruption that destroyed Halcyon. It was something far simpler, far more human, the dangerous illusion that desire and power can ever truly stay separate. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of memory, that single night on the rooftop still glowed, the beginning of everything that would one day burn. Mark Callahan had always believed he could control every variable. In business, in image, even in emotion. For years, his empire had been a monument to that belief, a fortress built from precision and calculation. But people aren't numbers, and love, or whatever it was he and Julia shared, was never something you could chart on a spreadsheet. After the company fell, the media tore into the story like wolves. Reporters dug up every text, every timestamp, every blurry photograph. They painted Julia as the scheming mistress, the manipulative assistant who seduced her way into power. They called Mark a hypocrite, a fallen genius, another powerful man brought down by his weakness. Their faces were plastered across news channels for weeks. Their names trended on social media beside words like betrayal, fraud, and scandal. What no one saw, though, was how deeply the guilt had begun to rot Mark from the inside. He spent his mornings watching the markets collapse, seeing the numbers dive lower each day. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The mirror became his enemy, his reflection, unrecognizable. He had lost the company, his wife, his friends, even the loyalty of people who once swore they'd follow him anywhere. But the worst loss was quieter, his sense of purpose. Julia, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a kind of exile. The world had reduced her to a headline. She tried to apply for jobs, but every interview ended the same way. Polite smiles, lingering glances, an apology that wasn't really an apology. No one wanted to hire the woman who brought down Halcyon. She sold her car, then her apartment. Eventually, she rented a small place above a bookstore on the edge of the city. She lived simply, almost invisibly, spending her days in silence and her nights replaying everything that had happened, every decision, every mistake. One evening, months after the collapse, Mark showed up at her door. He looked older, gray at the temples, hollow around the eyes. He didn't knock right away. When he finally did, Julia hesitated before opening it. The sight of him was a wound she thought she'd already learned to live with. "I had to see you," he said quietly. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around her small apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the worn-out sofa, the half-empty coffee cup on the table. This was a world so far removed from the marble floors and skyline views they'd once shared. "They're auctioning off what's left of the company," he said finally. "Halcyon will be gone by next week. I thought you should know." She nodded. There was no emotion in her face, only a kind of acceptance. "It was never ours to keep," she said softly. He wanted to say more, that he missed her, that he wished things had been different, that he would trade everything to go back to that rooftop before the first mistake. But every word felt like a lie now, hollow and heavy. Before he left, he placed a folded envelope on her table. "There's enough in there to start over," he murmured. Julia looked at it but didn't touch it. "You still think money can fix things," she said. Mark's shoulders sagged. He nodded once, turned, and walked out. She never saw him again. In the years that followed, Halcyon became a case study in business schools, a cautionary tale about ethics, power, and desire. Professors dissected it in lectures. Journalists referenced it in articles about corporate collapse. The story became larger than the people in it, a myth, a morality play. But the truth, the real truth, lived only in the quiet spaces between Julia and Mark's memories. Julia eventually left the city. She took a job under a different name, working for a small consultancy firm in a coastal town where no one recognized her. She lived by the sea, where the air smelled of salt and the waves drowned out the noise of the past. Sometimes, when she walked along the shore at dusk, she would think of Mark, not with longing, but with a strange, distant understanding. They had both been victims of the same illusion, that they could mix passion and ambition and still remain whole. Mark, as far as anyone knew, never recovered. His vineyard in Italy became his refuge, but the locals said he rarely spoke, rarely smiled. He lived alone, writing notes in a leather-bound journal that no one was allowed to touch. When he died years later, quietly and without ceremony, that journal was found beside him. Inside were pages filled not with numbers or business plans, but memories of Julia, of Halcyon, of the night the world had seemed infinite and theirs. The final line, written in his unsteady hand, read, "Empires don't fall because of weakness. They fall because of the people who believe they are too strong to break." Julia read those words years later when a journalist sent her a copy of his obituary.
She didn't cry.
She simply closed her eyes and let the wind carry the ache away. In another life, maybe they could have been something pure. But in this one, they were the storm that ruined everything. The office affair that toppled a billion-dollar company, and the two people who learned too late that love, in the wrong hands, can be just as destructive as power. Years passed. The world moved on, as it always does. The Halcyon scandal became a footnote in documentaries, a cautionary slide in corporate ethics seminars. People quoted it in meetings, journalists mentioned it when a new scandal broke, and the name, Mark Callahan, turned from symbol of success to a synonym for downfall. But for those who had lived it, the memory never really faded. It lingered, like the aftertaste of something sweet that had turned bitter too late to spit out. Julia Benton built a quiet life for herself on the coast of Portugal. She rented a small white cottage near the cliffs, where the sea wind was sharp and honest, and the nights smelled of rain. No one there knew who she was. To the locals, she was Miss Jules, the polite woman who worked remotely for some consulting firm and always tipped generously at the cafe by the harbor. She had learned to live with silence, to be content with the simplicity of anonymity. Some nights, when the wind howled too loudly, she would wake up sweating, flashes of boardrooms and headlines haunting her half-dreams. The sound of a phone vibrating in her imagination. Mark's voice saying her name in the dark. She'd sit by the window, watching the black water churn, and whisper to herself, "It's over. It's done." But some ghosts don't die. They just sleep inside you, waiting for the right storm. One winter morning, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, heavy, deliberate. She knew before she even opened it that it was from Mark, though she had thought him long gone. The letter wasn't long. "Jules, I don't expect forgiveness, or even understanding. I just need you to know that everything they said about you was wrong. You never ruined Halcyon. I did. My pride did. You were the only honest part of it. I should have said that years ago. I should have protected you. They'll be selling off what's left of the patents soon. You'll get a share. My lawyers know where to find you.
Take it."
Not as guilt money, but as something that was always yours. I still remember that night on the roof. The city lights looked infinite. I thought we were too. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it inside a drawer. She didn't reply. She didn't know that Mark had already died by the time the letter reached her. When the funds arrived months later, she used them not to escape, but to build something. She started a small foundation, unnamed, quiet, to help women in corporate environments navigate workplace exploitation and scandal. It wasn't about redemption. It was about giving others what she never had, a way out before the fall. As time passed, Julia began to write. Not memoirs, not confessionals, just stories. Fiction that danced around the truth, stories about love and ruin, about ambition and quiet grief. Under a pseudonym, she published her first novel, glass towers, and to her surprise, it found an audience. The critics called it achingly human. Readers saw pieces of themselves in it. None of them knew it was her story, retold in fragments and shadows. On the 10th anniversary of Halcyon's collapse, a documentary was released, The Fall of the Empire, The Halcyon Scandal. Julia watched it alone. They showed old footage of Mark at conferences, smiling into microphones, full of life and confidence. They showed images of her, grainy and stolen, walking out of the building that final day. The narrator said, "Some say it was greed. Others say it was love. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was just two people who forgot where the line was and paid the price." When the credits rolled, Julia turned off the TV. She opened her window. The sea roared below, endless and alive. She let the wind fill the room, let the salt sting her eyes until the tears didn't feel like sorrow anymore. She whispered his name once, softly, as if it might finally rest there, among the waves, among the ruins, among the countless human stories of people who thought they were unbreakable. And as the wind carried it away, Julia realized that she no longer felt haunted. The past wasn't gone, but it had loosened its grip. The empire was ashes, yes, but from those ashes, she had built something gentler, something hers. Somewhere out there, maybe in a vineyard in Italy or in the fragments of a bankrupt company's archives, Mark's story had ended. But hers, quietly, defiantly, was still being written. It happened quietly, as most reckonings do. Julia had been living in her seaside cottage for nearly 12 years when the past finally found her again. It was late autumn, the sky gray and swollen with the promise of rain. She was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping tea and marking up the draft of her next novel, another story about love and ruin, when she heard a knock at the door. It was a polite, hesitant knock, the kind that doesn't expect an answer. When she opened the door, a young woman stood there, mid-20s, with a notebook in hand and a nervous smile. "Miss Jules Benton?" she asked. Julia froze. Hardly anyone used her real name anymore. "Who's asking?" "My name's Amelia Grant. I'm a journalist with the Atlantic Review. I'm working on a long-form piece about Halcyon, the real story, not the headlines. I think you know why I'm here." For a long moment, Julia just stood there. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs. Inside, her heart thudded in her chest. "You're 12 years too late," she said finally. "Maybe," Amelia replied softly. "But I don't think the story's over yet." Julia almost closed the door. Almost. But something in the girl's eyes, the same mix of ambition and curiosity she once saw in her own reflection, stopped her. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The interview began awkwardly. Amelia tried to be gentle, but her questions carried the weight of everything Julia had run from. The affair, the leaks, the fall, the public humiliation, the silence afterward. Julia answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and after an hour, she stood by the window, staring at the restless sea. "You all think it was about love," Julia said at last, her voice quiet but sharp. "But it wasn't. Not really. It was about loneliness. About power, about needing to feel seen in a place where everyone was replaceable." Amelia didn't speak. She just wrote. Julia turned to her. Mark wasn't a monster. He was human, and that's what ruined him. He believed that emotions could be contained, that you could have everything, power, control, and passion, without any consequence. But power doesn't share. It consumes. It always does. When Amelia left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sea gold and blood red. Before she stepped outside, she hesitated. "You know, people would forgive you now," she said. "The world's changed. They'd want to hear your side." Julia smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing too much. "Forgiveness isn't the point," she said. "I already forgave myself. That's enough." After Amelia left, Julia sat at her desk and opened a drawer. Inside was Mark's old letter, yellowed with age. She read it one last time, then lit a match. The paper curled and blackened, the words disappearing into smoke. She opened the window, letting the ashes drift out over the cliffs, scattering into the wind. The next morning, she began to write again. But this time, the story wasn't about love or ruin. It was about freedom, quiet, unremarkable freedom, the kind that doesn't make headlines. Months later, the Atlantic Review published the article. The headline read, "The Woman Behind the Fall, Julia Benton Speaks After 12 Years of Silence." The piece was surprisingly compassionate. It painted her not as a villain or a victim, but as something more complex, a survivor of her own choices, a woman who had once stood too close to power and been burned by it. Readers were divided, of course. Some sympathized. Others judged. But for the first time in years, Julia didn't care. The story trended for a week. Then, like all stories, it faded. The world found new scandals, new headlines, new people to tear apart. Julia's next book, Salt and Silence, came out the following year. It was her most personal work, the kind of novel that didn't hide behind fiction anymore. It ended not with tragedy, but with release. Critics called it the quiet redemption of a woman history refused to understand. On the day the book launched, Julia walked to the edge of the cliffs, the same place she always went when she needed to think. The wind was wild, the sea silver under the sun. She stood there for a long while, watching the horizon, until the ache that had once lived in her chest began to feel like something else. Not sorrow, not guilt, but peace. She realized then that the empire had fallen, yes, but she had not. She had endured, stripped of glory, of wealth, of reputation, and what was left was something unbreakable. Far away, somewhere in the ruins of time, the story of Halcyon still echoed. People would always talk about the affair, the scandal, the collapse. But the truth, the human truth, lived only with her. That two people had once believed they were untouchable and had learned, painfully, that even the strongest towers crumble when built on secrets. Julia turned from the sea and walked home. The tide rolled in behind her, erasing her footprints in the sand. This time, she didn't look back.